was planned for 2020. And we had very exciting presentations on Merseyside when we were down at our previous conference in Bridgewater. And then fortunately, we did receive the Industrial Heritage book on the Industrial Heritage of Merseyside, which we've been able to look at, even though we can't actually be in the area. So it was very disappointing when in 2021, we once again had to cancel an in-person conference in Liverpool. And I'd like to thank the Merseyside Industrial Heritage Society for their patience in the reorganisation, and thank them, as I say, for that excellent guidebook they produced. And I really would like to thank John McGuinness, our conference secretary, who's put a lot of effort into this, and of course Bill Barksfield, our webmaster, whose excellent guidance has brought us to the beginning of this conference, and we hope that we're going to remain throughout it. It won't be Bill's fault if we're not. It's very valuable to have someone like him now that we're so dependent on online talks. So I'd like to welcome all the delegates to this first online session of the 2021 AIA conference. Two speakers, I think, are addressing an international audience. You've seen quite a few participants already, those from China, those from Japan. And, you know, this is the great advantage of Zoom, that we do get this much wider conference, even if we perhaps lack the social interaction that we would have had we been meeting in person in Liverpool, and which were always a hallmark of AIA conferences. So, as you know, Bill Barksfield has muted you all. It's recommended that you turn off your cameras as well. And obviously the PowerPoint presentations will begin. Now, those of you used to Zoom will know that there is a chat facility, and at the bottom of your screen, the second one in from participants, it says chat. And if you press chat, you can record a question on your screen. And Anna will be noting those questions and relaying as many of them as possible at the end of the talks. Anna, who is the chair of the Merseyside Industrial Heritage, is going to introduce the speakers and then relay the questions at the end. Now, thanks to the speakers, the talks are being recorded, the question and answer is being recorded, and it'll be made available via the AIA's YouTube channel later, so you can always catch up on it. So I'd like to pass over at this time to Anna Alexander, the chair of Merseyside Industrial Heritage Society, to introduce our two speakers for today, at which point I will mute myself and remove my camera. Thank you, Anna.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Marilyn, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to introduce this morning's two speakers who will explore the industrial heritage of Merseyside. Merseyside's Industrial Heritage Society was founded in 1964 and has been at the forefront of researching and conserving this heritage over the last 56 years. Maurice Handley and Rob Jones are two leading members of our society, and they have contributed much to this aim over many years. Our first speaker is Maurice Handley, who, after graduating in mechanical engineering, spent most of his working life teaching in further education colleges in the UK and abroad. Following early retirement, he studied landscape interpretation and archaeology at the University of Liverpool. He is a member of Merseyside Archaeological Society, Liverpool Geological Society, St Helens Historical Society, the Association for Industrial Archaeology, and Merseyside Industrial Heritage Society. With his colleague and co-editor Paul Rees, Maurice was responsible for producing our Society's Guide to the Industrial Heritage of Merseyside, which gives an introduction to the industrial heritage of Merseyside and features some of the designated buildings, docks, canals, railways, and other miscellaneous sites that form part of the rich archaeology of the industrial and post-industrial periods. He is therefore well placed to talk to us on the subject of the industrial heritage of Merseyside. Over to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Anna. I hope everyone can hear me. Bill, could you just give me an indication? Thank you, Bill. Yes. Well, good morning, everybody, or perhaps good afternoon, or good evening, or bonjour, buenos dias, good day, ni hao. This is my brief guide to the industrial heritage of Merseyside, and the picture is taken from the Mersey Ferry. It's the three buildings which form what is known locally as the Three Graces. They're the centrepiece of Liverpool's world famous waterfront. And Liverpool is at the centre of Merseyside. So if you don't know where Liverpool is, it's on the northwest coast of England. Here's Liverpool, and Merseyside consists of, the borough consists of five boroughs. The county consists of 5 boroughs. Liverpool itself, Sefton, which lies to the north up to Southport with its pier. Knowsley in this area, St Helens, a town to the north east of Liverpool, and Wirral, which is a separate peninsula formerly part of Cheshire. At this stage, it's worth saying that the docks of Liverpool stretch for about 10 kilometres from point just south of Liverpool up to Bootle in the north, Crosby, almost to Crosby. And this is a view of the historic dock of Liverpool, known as the Albert Dock or Royal Albert Dock. Here's the Mersey, and on the far side of the Mersey is Birkenhead and Wirral. And in the distance is the Irish Sea. You might just be able to make out some offshore wind generating plant. I'm going to be talking about this side of the Mersey, the Lancashire or north side of the Mersey, and my good friend Rob will be talking about the left bank, as it were, of the Mersey in Wirral. I'm going to structure the talk around listed buildings. Now, some of you may not know what listed buildings are, so basically they are protected buildings classified by Historic England in 3 grades. Grade 1 buildings are buildings of outstanding interest, and I will use the symbol L1 to designate those. Particularly important buildings which don't quite have the features of a grade 1 building are listed grade 2 or L2 star. And then the third grade, grade 2 buildings, are buildings of special interest and worth preserving, and I'll designate those by L2. These are the most common buildings. We also have scheduled monuments which have legal protection. So if you want to work on a listed building or demolish it, you need permission from Historic England if it's a grade 1 or 2 star, as well as planning permission. A scheduled monument needs legal position from the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport in the government. Grade 2 buildings just need planning permission. In Merseyside, there are something like 3,000 listed buildings, the vast majority in Liverpool, which has more listed buildings than anywhere, any city in the country, except London. A good example of a grade 1 listed building is the Royal Albert Dock, or just Albert Dock, completed in 1846 and opened 175 years ago last weekend. It forms part of the former UNESCO World Heritage Site, which I'll say a little bit more later on. An example of a grade 2 listed, grade 2 star listed building is Speke Airport. This airport was completed just before the start of the Second World War, based on a German design, the airport terminal with its control tower. It's no longer in use. There is a new airport, the John Lennon Airport in Liverpool. In the background there, you can see one of the two hangars, which has this Art Deco decoration on it. An example of a more common listed grade 2 building, L2, is Everton Water Tower. This tower was built when water was brought into Liverpool in 1857 from Rivington in the South Pennines, about 50 kilometres away. It was brought on an aqueduct to this via a reservoir just outside Liverpool, and then to this water tower, which has a tank in the top, which has unusual buttresses around the outside. The later Vyrnwy aqueduct from central Wales was brought in 1892. This is the this is the Cannington Shore bottle shop. This was not a place for making bottles, but for making, not for selling bottles, but for making bottles. And in here, there would have been a furnace, regenerative furnace, Siemens regenerative furnace, with a cone above it to ventilate the area around the furnace. And then around the furnace, there would have been a number of men and boys, up to 50 men and boys, working, blowing bottles at an enormous rate, thousands of bottles a day. Unfortunately, this is in a very poor condition. It's a scheduled monument and it's listed grade 2. Nearby in St Helens is Pilkins's Cone House, and this here you can see the cone, which was above the regenerative furnace. This was used for making flat glass, and Pilkington's factory is in the background here, now owned by a Japanese company, Nippon Sheet Glass. The chimneys here, this chimney in particular is for the furnace, which used to make float glass. It's now mothballed. In the foreground here, you can see the Sankey Canal, which was arguably the first canal in the area, and supplied St Helens with material for glass making, but primarily took coal to the River Mersey. Going back to Pier Head, here's the Three Graces on the right, with the Royal Liver building. Built in 1910, listed grade 1. The Cunard building, built in 1913, listed grade 2 star. And the Port of Liverpool building, formerly the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board building, built in 1907, also listed grade 2 star. These are structures with steel frame or reinforced concrete frames, with cladding in Portland stone in these two cases, and granite in the case of the Liverpool, the Liver building. This is the Leeds and Liverpool Canal coming in its new extension, which was built in 2009. Here's the ferry terminal for the Mersey ferry. And in the distance there, this particular tower block is adjacent to Prince's Half Tide Dock, which my colleague Mark Adams will be talking about later in this series. To the north of this area is the Stanley Dock Conservation Area, and formerly part of the World Heritage Site. Stanley Dock lies between this building and this building. It was originally built between this warehouse and this warehouse by Jesse Hartley, the dock engineer from 1824 to 1860. Subsequently, just at the beginning of the 20th century, the dock was partially filled in and this enormous tobacco warehouse was built. This, at the time it was built, was the largest brick building in the world. This warehouse is a tea warehouse built also in the 19th century. The docks that Jesse Hartley built along the riverfront were built out into the river. Here you can see the dock road running north, and Hartley built a sea wall or a river wall so that the docks could be built in deep water out into the river. He also built an access from the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, which came down through a series of locks in this area, and canal boats could go through the Stanley Dock into Collingwood Dock, then Salisbury Dock, and then now a link has been made, a new link has been made into Pier Head that we saw earlier. This dock is Nelson Dock, and beyond that is Bradley Moor Dock. And that is the end of the conservation area. Beyond there, we have here the wastewater treatment works at Sandon Dock, associated with the Mersey Estuarine Pollution Alleviation Scheme, which is an interceptor, main interceptor sewer that runs all the way along the dock road behind the docks. This particular building here is the Bradley Moor hydraulic pumping station. And there's another hydraulic pumping station here at Stanley Dock. And if we look down Stanley Dock, as if we were entering it by canal boat, here's that hydraulic pumping station. Next to it is Hartley's Stanley Dock Warehouse, completed in 1854. Opposite is the massive tobacco warehouse, completed in 1900. This is being converted into flats, and the Titanic Hotel has already been converted into a hotel. The Titanic Hotel is listed grade 2 star. Here we have a bascule bridge which hinges on this quadrant here. And then in the background is the clock tower at Salisbury. This is the top of the locks down into Stanley Dock on the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. The locks drop down underneath the railway bridge to the left is the tobacco warehouse, and you can just see the top of the Titanic Hotel there. And this particular boat is steam powered. Here's the Bradley Moor Dock pump house, built in 1848, listed grade 2. It's a heritage building at risk. Beyond it is the wastewater treatment plant, and to the left here is Bradley Moor Dock, and a recent application to build a football stadium in the dock, to partially fill the dock and construct a new football stadium, has been permitted, and this has prompted the UNESCO to remove the World Heritage status from Liverpool. Further north in Bootle, there's another pump house, as I said, one of several in Merseyside. And this is under risk as well. It's listed grade 2. Beyond here is the modern docks with a container terminal in the background. There are 2 road tunnels underneath the Mersey connecting Liverpool with Birkenhead. The first road tunnel was built in 1934, and I've trespassed onto Rob's territory here. This is actually in Birkenhead, this brick-built ventilation tower on the edge of the river in Birkenhead. On the opposite side of the river in Liverpool, this is a ventilation tower of the 1971 Kingsway Tunnel. On the Liverpool side, the road tunnel has a ventilation tower here, built in, well, faced with Portland stone, a very attractive building, and that's the control room also, built in 1934, listed grade 2. And here's the Liver building in the background with the Liver bird on the top there. This particular building, I long thought was a hydraulic pumping station, but it's actually the pumping station for the railway. The railway tunnel runs underneath here, and the railway engineers built the tunnel underneath the river without realizing that the river had been over deepened by glacial action, and the roof of the tunnel was in unconsolidated sediments. So it takes in a lot of water, and that water has to be pumped out frequently. And here you can see the water being pumped out. Originally, it was driven by, the pump was driven by a steam engine, which was in a boiler house, for which you can just make out the roof line there. This dock here is George's Dock Passage. It dates from 1771. George's Dock was originally where the Liver building and the Three Graces are, and they were built on the infilled dock. I've mentioned railways, so we can't not talk about the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, arguably the first intercity passenger railway in the world, opened in 1830, but built in this part of it in 1829. This was the original railway, which ran down through a tunnel to the riverside at Wapping. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway is well known all over the world for the Rainhill trials. This is Rainhill Station in St Helens, and the Skew Bridge. Skew Bridge is called a Skew Bridge because it doesn't cross the line at a right angle, or it's not perpendicular to the line. It crosses at an oblique angle. So the arch is a special construction to take into account the fact that it's not square. Both these, both the station and the skew bridge are listed grade 2. This is a rather unique photograph because there would have been a metal footbridge across here, but it had been removed in 2012 so that the electrification could take place and the power lines for the railway, the overhead lines for the railway, could go underneath it. It's been replaced and raised. About a kilometre to the east of Rainhill Station is this little bridge here, which is called Bourne's Tunnel. It's not actually a tunnel, but it's a bridge. And this is where the Rainhill trials took place. So Robert Stephenson's rocket, drawn here, taking part in the trials. This was where it was proved that steam locomotives would be suitable for high-speed travel, drawing passenger and goods trains. This is called Bourne's Tunnel because it was built specially for a coal mine owner called Peter Bourne, so that he could bring his horse-drawn trucks through underneath the railway and take them down to the turnpike and Warrington Road in Rainhill. The plateway was built with the aid of George Stephenson. He supplied the rails, probably spare rails from the original railway up here, which were on stone sleeper blocks. And this completed in by October 1829, before the Rainhill trials. The bridge is listed grade 2. A more substantial bridge carrying the railway over the river, or rather the Sankey Brook, is a few more kilometres towards Manchester. This is a 9-arch bridge with the spans of just over 15 metres, and the height of the arch is just over 18 metres. This was built with very high clearance deliberately because this is the line of the Sankey Canal as it was, and boats coming up the canal would sail underneath this arch, which had to be high enough to accommodate the Mersey flats, which are flat-bottomed boats, sailing boats with sail and mast, which would pick up coal or and take it down to the Mersey, or would bring in copper ore and other items for making glass in St Helens. Just behind me, when I took that photograph, is Bradley Lock, which is part of the Sankey Canal, which is still in water. Sankey Canal built in 1757. It was the first summit canal, that is a canal with locks in England, but it was 20 years behind the Irish, and 200 years behind the French, and 2,000 years behind the Chinese. The canal was superseded by a railway which was built in 1832, just after the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. That railway ran from St Helens to Widnes on the river. And this is a bridge carrying the Warrington Turnpike over the railway, built by Charles Blacker Vignoles, a famous civil engineer, who became a famous civil engineer after he built this. It's got 5 arches, but unfortunately 2 of the arches are buried in undergrowth here, and the other 2 arches here are also buried in undergrowth. So here's a map of the St Helens, Prescott, Wiston area. Here's St Helens. The Sankey Canal ran from St Helens in a loop round to Warrington and then eventually down to Widnes. When they built the railway from St Helens, it ran straight down into Widnes. It's worthwhile pointing out here is the modern Liverpool airport, Hale Wood nearby, Prescott and Wiston, which I'll mention in a little while. This is the motorway or freeway M62. To the north of this road, this motorway, is the exposed coal field. So almost this entire area is on coal. To the south of the motorway, we have sandstone, and the coal dips underneath the sandstone. So there was a lot of coal mining in this area, which of course stimulated industrial development. You won't find these days much evidence of coal mining. This is the standard method for capping an old coal mine shaft with this, looks like a trig point on it. This is the old cars drainage shaft. It's about as near as I think we can get to the possible site of the first Newcomen type engine in Lancashire. Built round about 1720, very early Newcomen engine. And we know it was built in this area because it's mentioned in Nicholas Blundell's diary that he visited Mr. Case's pit or new engine house. The most recent coal mine in Merseyside was in St Helens at Parkside, and that was sunk in 1957 and closed in 1993. So a long history of coal mining in this area. Coal from Prescott and Wiston was taken down to the river at Hale Cliff, almost due south, from the 17th century onwards. There's evidence for coal mining earlier than that in Prescott and in St Helens. So coal would be brought down here, loaded onto boats and taken to Liverpool, or taken across to the salt works in Cheshire. And there was a salt works on this site as well. Mention of Hale leads me to Hale Wood, which is where Ford established a factory in the 1960s and produced some rather famous cars. This is a Ford Escort in the museum in Liverpool. But there was an earlier motor industry in Merseyside, the Vulcan Works in Southport, at the very northern edge of Sefton Borough, built this Edwardian car and carried on in business, building lorries and associated with the motor trade until a few years after the Second World War. The factory was demolished last year, and I think there was a report about the factory in the most recent edition of the Industrial Archaeology Review. In Prescott, which has a number of watchmakers' cottages, it was a cottage industry in Prescott for many years. There was also the Lancashire Watch Factory, which was in operation from 1899 to 1911. This is listed grade 2, now being converted into flats for people with mobility problems and elderly people. To the west of Prescott is the Kirby, the site of the Kirby Royal Ordnance Factory, Second World War Ordnance Factory, mainly producing shells. It was an enormous site, employing 22,000 people, most of whom were women This particular structure here is one of the storage shelters for those shells. It was originally covered in a grass so that it would be camouflaged. It's one of 10 such shelters. It has railway access, and this is a remnant of that railway with the training structures for the for training people to electrify the West Coast main line. The two shelters you can see, this one and the one in the background, along with two others, were demolished last year. Fortunately, Oxford Archaeology North did do a very good survey of these. The 6 remaining shelters were the subject of a listed building application, which was rejected by Historic England. There are several model villages in Merseyside. This is one that was built for Hartley's jam factory. William Hartley built this factory with a rather impressive gateway entrance, which is almost all that exists of the factory. He built the factory and a village for his workers between 1886 and 1895. They're both listed grade 2. Another example of workers' housing is this one in St Helens, Factory Row, which was built initially for the first glassmaking works in St Helens, which was behind these houses here. That was established in the late 18th century, and then this row of cottages was extended into this end, which was built in the mid 19th century. In the background is a factory which nowadays produces glass fibre insulation. In Liverpool, Liverpool Corporation built some community housing at Eldon Grove between 1911 and 1912. These are listed grade 2, currently being refurbished. And here's a gas street light. All of this listed grade 2. In Bootle, there are rows and rows of workers' houses close to the docks, which you can see in the background. These are typical of the streets in Bootle.
10 minutes, Maurice.
Thank you, Anna. Where did the bosses live? Well, this is a house in the Georgian Quarter on Rodney Street. Supposedly the birthplace of Henry Booth, who was a director and founder of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company. Unfortunately, although it's listed grade 2 by Historic England, he wasn't born here. He was actually born here. And then the house was demolished when they widened this street, Hardman Street. So it's slightly wrong, but you get a good idea of what sort of house he lived in. Behind me, just across the road behind me, is the home of the Gladstone family, famous Prime Minister. Also on Rodney Street is Mackenzie's grave. Alexander Mackenzie was a railway engineer who built the line down into Lime Street. Originally, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway didn't terminate at Lime Street station. It, as I said earlier, went down to Wapping, but he built the line down into Lime Street. He went on to become a well-established railway engineer working with another famous railway engineer from the area called Thomas Brassey. At the end of Rodney Street is the Anglican Cathedral, and in the cemetery, the older cemetery next to the cathedral, is Huskinson's monument. Huskinson was the Member of Parliament for Liverpool who was killed when the rocket struck him, not during the trials, but on the opening day of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway in 1830. Merseyside has a very mixed population from all over Britain and the world indeed. This is the Welsh Chapel in St Helens. Because there's an abundance of coal, cheap coal in St Helens, it paid to bring copper ore from North Wales, from Anglesey, North Wales, into St Helens along the canal and then eventually along the railway, and smelt the copper ore in St Helens, and then export it out again to back to Wales, actually, to be made into either copper sheets for copper-bottomed ships or other copper things like cooking pots and so on. This is interesting. It always fascinates me, this building, because it's got a wall built from copper furnace slag. The furnace slag from smelting the copper was used to make this wall and the wall of the house behind. And in fact, it's quite common in this area. You find little 19th century chapels elsewhere with the same feature. In the middle of the 19th century, it was realised that Liverpool had to have a good drainage system, sewer system, because of people catching cholera. So sewers were put in the 19th century. This is a sewer vent, it's listed grade 2. It's not in its original position. Its original position was around the corner in the background, but a large house builder decided to move it, and they placed it on the middle of a railway bridge, made out of cast iron. The other sewer vent here is not made out of cast iron, it's made out of I think cast aluminium at the base and fiberglass on top. It's one of a large number of these vents which vent the intersection sewer that I mentioned earlier for the Merseyside Estuary Pollution Alleviation Scheme. First I got excited about this when I thought, oh, another Victorian sewer vent, but I was wrong. Some cast iron post boxes. This is a Liverpool special. In the Albert Dock, or not in the dock, sorry, by the Albert Dock, built in 1863, listed grade 2. There are only 3 of these, I think, in existence. There's another one in Liverpool and one in a museum in London. This one is over in Birkenhead, actually. I popped this in because I think this is one of only 6 in the country. And then there's the Pooly Gates, which are also cast iron, very elaborate cast iron structure, made up of, cast in one piece, I hasten to say, but a set of components fixed together with the ubiquitous liver bird, which you find all over Merseyside. This was cast by a company run by Henry Pooly, famous for making weighbridges. You can find Pooly weighbridges all over the place. The building to the left sits partly over the old dock of Liverpool, which dates from 1712, arguably again the first wet dock in the country. So with the liver bird, I'm getting near to the leaving of Liverpool. This particular photograph is of Fiddleless Ferry Power Station, taken 3 years ago when we had a very cold day, cold week. And I think this was probably the last time this power station was fired up. It's now been closed down. It isn't in what I would call technically Merseyside. It's besides the Mersey. It lies just over the border or adjacent to the border of Merseyside city region. And I'm actually standing more or less in St Helens. When I took this picture, I'm standing on the border of St Helens. So as I say, it's now closed, probably never to work again. So thank you for watching my presentation. Gracias. Merci. Cherchez.
Thank you very much, Maurice. That was excellent. And I know you've got so many more things you could have told us, but the time was against you. So shall we take a 10-minute break, everybody, so that you can have a cup of tea or do whatever you want to do, and we will reconvene at 11:30, if that's all right with everybody. Is that all right, Marilyn?
That's fine, Anna. Yep,
okay,
that's
right.
fine.
Well,
Good
see you in 10 minutes, if that's all
Yep.
right with you. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Restoring old vehicles. Rob has been secretary of the Merseyside Tramway Preservation Society for 28 years and sung in a church choir for over 50 years. He has edited the Merseyside Industrial Society monthly newsletter for 16 years, and this celebrated its 400th edition in 2020, a great achievement. His most recent achievement is the publication of a book, Birkenhead Tramcar Manufacturers 1859 to 1913, which explores this little known aspect of Birkenhead's industrial history. Rob will talk to us about Wirral's industrial heritage. Over to you, Rob.
Testing, testing. Can you hear me?
Yes, everything is fine. Thank you, Rob.
Okay, let's launch. Just to explain, the words in italics are on the images are the attribution or copyright. You don't really need to read that. If there are none, they are from my own ownership of copyright. Let's get a move on. 40 minutes is not enough for me to discuss this topic. Wirral is a peninsula of about 100 square miles, a bit smaller than the island of Malta. Wirral is surrounded by two rivers, the River Dee on the west side, the Mersey on the east side. On the north side is the Irish Sea. The River Dee coastline has a story of gradual silting up northwards, which began as early as the Roman times. The black arrow points to Wirral. You can see it at the epicenter of Great Britain. Wirral is part of Merseyside, as Maurice mentioned. And next slide, please. We know where Wirral is. Okay. Our first industry is milling, the longest lived industry on Wirral, where water power at first, and then there were two in the Doomsday Survey of 1086. The map shows the number of mills on Wirral. The map also shows the original shoreline, a dotted line near the green arrow. To the right are two surviving mills. At the top is the largest surviving windmill on Wirral at Williston, built in 1800. And the lower picture is Bidston Mill. Today it still has its sails, even though it stopped milling in 1875. It's now in the care of Wirral Borough Council. Now, can I draw your attention to where the green arrow is pointing? Burton Point, a sticky out bit of rock into the Dee. Let's look at this in more detail. I feel an extractive industry coming on. Can you set your clock back to 1277? The place on the left-hand image was once a small port for the export of sandstone. The old shoreline is now a coastal cycleway and follows quarries to one side and a bird sanctuary on what was the River Dee. Burton Point faces the town of Flint on the Welsh side of the Dee, and Flint Castle as seen on the right-hand picture. This is our first record of extractive industry. Sandstone was sent from Burton Point to Flint to build this castle. Now we're going up the Dee coast to another port that was doomed by silting up. Next slide, please. In 1550, Neston had the highest population in Wirral. Look at the map. It's from 1830. Can you see Old Quay? Follow the blue arrow. In 1732, the new quay became Old Quay, as you can see on this map. Now, the quay was started in 1545. It was very slow and expensive to build. Neston was trading with Spain and Ireland, but the quay became choked with sand. The picture in the top left corner has a road sign that says Quayside, a little optimistic as the water is now about half a mile away. Close by here was a colliery from 1759, which the Neston collieries closed in 1927. The red arrow on the map points to Denner Coal Works, and the row of houses are miners' houses still there today. The red brick wall lower left is at Riverside Way, site of one of the coal mine shafts. The mine seams went out under the River Dee. Coal was moved along in long, thin boats to the bottom in canals. This was before Bridgewater. We're leaving Neston now and going back to the coast, a little bit further north to Neston's satellite at Park Gate. If you look at the map, you can see 8 on the map. Neston Park was created in 1250. This village was possibly named since it was adjacent to the park's gate. As the quay at Neston silted up and ships got larger, Park Gate gained in prominence. Some authors say that from 1636 there was a ferry service to Baghilt and Flint on the other side of the river. Other experts dispute the ferry was this early. There wasn't a quay as such. Ships just anchored in the estuary and were unloaded onto smaller boats that came ashore. The sea wall we can see in the right-hand picture wasn't really for unloading ships, as it wasn't built till after 1800. The smaller picture shows a weint. A weint is a narrow passageway or alleyway. There are a few left in Old Liverpool and a number in Park Gate and Neston up the road. The internet suggests this word may be a term local to the area. To emphasize the importance of Park Gate, it had its own custom house. Silting gradually spoilt the sea trade, and by the 1820s, there were just 4 packets per week sailing to Ireland. Today, it's what you see in the picture, a place for cars and ice cream. We're moving further up the coast. Next slide, please. The Domesday Book lists Gayton as having 2 fisheries. One of them remarkably survives, as can be seen on the map. Fish ponds gave a controlled source of food. They were a mark of power and authority, hence them being mentioned in Domesday Book. Only rich nobles could afford to maintain them. Incidentally, the head gardener at Gayton Hall allowed me to take this picture. Nuff said. In 1277, King Edward I crossed to Wales from Gayton. Like most of the Dee ports, it's silted up now. King William, also known as William of Orange, sailed onto Ireland in 1690. It's so easy to underestimate the importance of little places like this in times past. You can see Wales in the distance. We've finished with the River Dee now. We're going round the corner. Next slide, please. The town of Mells is believed to be the place where an item of jewellery was made called a fibula, which was common in Roman times, not only for the military, but also civilians. It's a clasp to hold a cloak on the shoulder. The Wirral version has its main distinguishing feature of a brightly coloured enamel checkerboard pattern. It was the must-have Hugo Boss adornment of its day. The map shows the high incidence of this design of brooch and its discovery in other parts of Roman Britain. Examples of this type are on display at the Museum of Liverpool at Pierhead. We could stay on this coast and talk about brickmaking, but we've no time. We're covering a much more interesting topic, gunpowder storage. We turn the corner into the River Mersey. Look for the blue arrow. I can't see it. I know. In the 18th century, many ships carried gunpowder. On the Mersey, the main place for gunpowder storage was in the heart of Liverpool dockland. It was felt that keeping gunpowder in Liverpool was dangerous, so Liverpool Corporation bought land near a sheltered entrance to the river, officially called Liskeard, where the guns of gunpowder could be stored in safety. Hence, this little part of Wallasey is still called the Magazines today. The demise of gunpowder storage occurred from 1850, when ships didn't have great need for it. The fort-type building we can see is a battery facing the river. It's nothing to do with gunpowder storage. It was built to prevent a possible French invasion. There was a similar fort on the other side of the river, but that one has totally gone now. This grand entrance to the fort is dated 1858. They had 7 10-inch guns. In 1899, the promenade was built in front of the fort, thus reducing considerably the field of fire for the guns. And by 1913, there was no risk of a French invasion. The fort was sold off. The entrance is listed Grade 2. The magazines were very close to this fort. In 1921, the Wallasey War Memorial was built on some of the land occupied by the fort and is there to this day. The area is a nice place to visit, and you can have a drink at the adjacent Magazines pub. Next slide, please. Just so you can get your bearings, here's a map of Birkenhead Docks. Maurice showed some view, and a lovely aerial view looking over here. The inlet from the Mersey was once called Wallasey Pool, but once the docks came in the 1840s, the area became known as the Great Float. It was split in half by a bridge that we shall see, thus making East Float and West Float. This is Woodside. This area is Woodside here. As we'll cover that in a bit more detail. Now we shall have a look at some of the artifacts you can see on the Birkenhead Docks today. Next slide, please. Birkenhead was chosen as a place to store newly refined oil around 1860, called kerosene. It was smokeless and odourless. Well, odourless when you compare it with whale oil. Liverpool had a long record of dockside fires and were happy to literally offload this commodity to Birkenhead. Here is one of the last casemates in Birkenhead Docks, where barrels of oil were passed and stored. The doors are set at a height where a wagon can back up to. They're still storing liquids there, as you can see in the right-hand picture. The doors are just iron with steel straps. And this is located on the Dock Road on the West Float north side. Next slide, please. More of the Birkenhead Docks. On the right-hand picture is this 1890 pump house. It regulated the height of the water in the docks. The chimney is listed Grade 2 and has had work done on it in the last 20 years. It forms an iconic background to many old pictures on the river. The winch on the left, dated 1860, has the name Trustees of the Birkenhead Docks. It was used to warp in sailing ships to through the locks and narrow passages, since sails were usually furled at this point. This is at the B Bridge, Egerton Dock. This bridge is a rolling counterweight bridge, similar, well, it's identical to the one we saw at Stanley Dock with Maurice's presentation. Built in the 1930s, it's at Duke Street, and this splits the Great Float into east and west. The bridge is due for replacement in the future, so visit it now. It's still used occasionally. When Birkenhead Docks opened, the name Great Float was used. A float is a dock filled at high tide and the level maintained by lock gates, like the float at Bristol, which predates these docks. There's a nicely restored wagon turntable in the foreground. You have to know it's there as it's not visible from the road. The square hydraulic tower on aptly named Tower Road originally had a pinnacle atop, but this was removed in the 1960s. The newer brickwork that can be seen was a rushed repair following bombing in 1941. The tower was functional since it had a huge weight pressing on a ram, which provided water pressure to work the lock gates, bridges, etc. The building is currently being promoted for reuse by Peel Holdings, Wirral Waters, so its future is secure. Now we're going half a mile beyond this structure back into Wallasey. Next slide, please. In 1852, a pottery was built here, a few hundred yards from the dockside. The workers came from Staffordshire to work in a brand new factory. Work continued until disaster struck when an uninsured cargo was lost at sea, resulting in financial embarrassment. Production ceased in 1873. Can you wheel in the sample pottery, please? Here are examples of Seacombe pottery. Although it shows the word Liverpool, you can make out Seacombe pottery. These exhibits are in the Williamson Art Gallery in Birkenhead, but not always on current display. The factory site became part of the fertilizer works, but we've no time to discuss guano, I'm afraid. Now, who likes chocolate? In 1954, Cadbury's, the chocolate maker, built a factory in Morton, which is part of Wallasey. It employed about 2,000 workers at its zenith. Today, most of it's becoming a housing estate. At the remaining part of the factory, they make Thai-Fu tea, as seen on the programme inside the factory. I imagine it employs as many as 30 people now. Let's go back to the docks. We spoke about milling earlier. It became industrialised in the 1870s, and Birkenhead had many mills on both sides of the float. Famous names such as Vernon's, Paul's, Buchanan's, Ranks and Spillers were here. They made not only flour, but cereal products, cattle cake. The last related industry being the Spillers dog biscuit factory in Seacombe, which closed in the 1980s. At one time, Wirral was the most important milling centre in the country. This must be true, as my geography teacher, Mr. Allison, told me. This warehouse we can see was built around 1870 to receive post-Civil War cheap American grain. It was in use until 2010. It is now flats, full marks for not demolishing it. It was another place bombed in 1941. Now, what's our next industry? Can you call it an industry? The Birkenhead Priory, facing the River Mersey, is the oldest building on Wirral and Merseyside. It was built in 1150. The Priory is listed Grade 1. Top right picture shows the main entrance today, shipyard to the right, Priory Chapel and remains to the left. It is surrounded by industry these days. There's a heritage centre well worth a visit, and a trip up the tower is a must. Superb views. The chapter house is Grade 2 star. Now it's quite small, nothing on a grand scale. Don't expect it to be like Fountains Abbey. Next slide, please. A ferry to Liverpool was run by the monks from 1380. Travellers had to wait for a ferry as weather was not predictable, and waiting was part of life, unlike today. The picture shows the church built in 1819 that adjoined the Priory. I want you to look at the old graveyard in the foreground. Next slide, please. Come on. This is what happened to part of the graveyard we saw in the last image. It had to be removed by an Act of Parliament. It was all started in 1953 and not completed until 1962, when it was opened by royalty. I imagine in the 1950s, there wasn't a resident archaeologist on site. I wonder what they missed. Anyway, we're sticking with the Priory. The 1819 church was called St. Mary's, mostly demolished now in the 1970s. Today, the area is called the Priory, and the chapel is managed from the nearby Anglican Church of Christ the King, and the service is held at the Priory once a month. Next image, please. Mersey ferries have existed for over 600 years. The one run by the Priory changed ownership in 1536 when it was dissolved. The Crown became the owners of the right of passage for the ferry to Liverpool. This interesting fact is continued this day by the placing of the Crown on the tops of the tubes which hold the counterbalances for the gangways on the ferry. Can you see the blue line? In Woodside Ferry Terminal building, they put a spare Crown top in a cabinet for you to see. The large picture was actually taken from Liverpool landing stage, looking over to Birkenhead. Can you see the shipyard cranes? The colour picture was taken a few weeks ago, shows the appalling remnant of the ferry gangway at Woodside, with all the architectural charm of a bomb site. But it still has the royal crown on it. We're going back to Wallasey, near where the pottery was. Before I move on, can we just do a time check? How are we doing? All right.
Hang on.
Thank you. We are near that pottery that we saw. In 1890,
Sorry, you've had 20 minutes, Rob. Sorry.
I'm afraid we're spot on time then.
Yeah.
In 1891, Captain Gandy moved his transmission belting company from Liverpool to Seacombe. He had been a ship's master from sailing days. Gandy discovered a way of using canvas to make transmission belting. It was an alternative to leather. It became a world-class company with very good marketing. Workers recall the smell around the area of Seacombe of hot melted resins. I do as a youngster. The company vanished in the 1980s when I believe asbestos claims may have ruined the company, since asbestos was used in the brake linings, which they had made since 1928. The building in the foreground is dated 1927 and was built following a disastrous fire. At one time, there were 300 employees, and this was Wallasey's biggest employer until Cadbury's in the 1950s. The company ceased to exist in the 1980s. The belting side became a part of Dunlop, but has now totally vanished. The factory site has been split up into individual units. Next slide, please. Now, we touched on shipbuilding. Let's go back to 1824, when William Laird, who had been working in Liverpool, established the Birkenhead Iron Works. You can see the blue line pointing to his boiler works on Wallasey Pool. The transition from boilers to iron ships is interesting. Rolling plates into cylinders uses the same expertise that is needed to roll frames of ships into the right shape. This first location was a nice cheap location with a good shelter in Wallasey Pool. But from the 1840s, William Laird sold his land on Wallasey Pool at a healthy profit to make way for the new Birkenhead Docks. And Laird's moved southwards and bought land on the river at Tranmere, as we shall see. Right on the view, the right-hand view shows the huge dry dock visible from the Priory Tower. We saw it being hewn earlier. Laird's built many famous ships, such as HMS Ark Royal, HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Rodney, the Mauritania II, at one time the biggest merchant ship made in England. In 1945, the shipyard employed 16,000 workers. Next slide, please. The image on the right is a dry dock and listed grade 2 star. The image was taken from the Priory Tower. I'm urging you all to go up. This is where the Confederate steamship Alabama was built. The model shown on the left is this ship and on view at the Williamson Art Gallery, where that pottery is. After the American Civil War ended, the British government had to pay reparations to compensate for the damage caused by this ship. One of the reasons I believe John Laird, the great iron ship builder, never received a knighthood. He was MP for the town at one time. Next slide, please. Come on. This was to be my last image, but I thought it appropriate to place it here. Wirral is still importing oil, which we mentioned many images ago, but now on an unimaginable scale at the Tranmere oil terminal. The oil terminal was built in 1960 to take the oil from supertankers and pump it to Stanlow. Here they can store 250,000 tons of oil at the Tranmere tank farm. And every 2 to 3 days, 100,000 tons arrives. A high proportion of the UK's requirement for oil arrives through this pipeline and tank farm. You can see the old stone jetty in the foreground. This place is well worth a visit, dear viewer. It was a seaplane base up to 1939. Next slide, please. We've not covered railways at all. Let's cover the first I can find in Wirral. In 1835, the Staunton Quarries built a tramway to move the quarried stone, mainly by gravity, to a quayside at Brumbrol, where it could be shipped to Liverpool. And also to the Sankey Viaduct, I wish to just point out. The quarry closed as late as 1959. A friend of mine tells me he remembers an American steam locomotive with cutters attached to the sides, which ran up and down a short length of track, cutting grooves that got deeper and deeper. The loco was then lifted between levels to start the process again. The grooves formed a line of weakness to break the stone away. At one time, some of the quarries were 200 feet deep, as seen in the picture. They were filled in with sandstone from the Mersey Road tunnel in the 1920s and 30s, and the ground is now level. The lady, my lovely wife, just here, is pointing to special stones in a wall at the former Staunton Quarry. Now, what could they be? Let's have a look on the next slide. These are stone blocks from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. They were sold in 1835 as being unsuitable for the heavier and faster loads on that railway. The holes had oak pegs with a spike that was nailed into them and secured the rail. Aren't these marvelous survivors? Next slide, please. The next railway that was built just 5 years later was the Chester and Birkenhead. It was eventually absorbed into a joint railway belonging to the LMS and GWR. The colour image shows the route of the Staunton tramway, where the Chester and Birkenhead passed over the Staunton line. The yellow you can see on the bridge is a Merseyrail train passing over. Few people know this today, that the pathway was at one time a tramway. Next slide, please. We're sticking with permanent way. In 1860, the first modern street tramway on American lines in the UK commenced in Birkenhead, going from Woodside to the park entrance. Transport enthusiasts may be interested to know that a Birkenhead tram made in 1876 is in the Wirral Transport Museum, and the lower left picture shows it in the museum. This tram was made by Starbucks. Nothing to do with coffee. I'm always asked. They were tram makers in Birkenhead as we shall see in the next image. Birkenhead is proud of these facts, and a red plaque was unveiled by the Transport Trust and the Mayor of Wirral in 2010. It's located on the wall of the building shown in the lower right picture. The blue arrow points to this location, and it was taken on opening day in 1860. Other tramcar factories followed. Here we have a Plinlimmon and Hafford tram straddling Cleveland Street in Birkenhead, about 1895, outside the tramcar factory. I've included the picture as it's the only one showing the factory. Note the gable in both pictures, green arrow. The colour picture on the right is the very same factory earlier this year, when open toast rack Douglas tramcar number 11, made in 1886, returned to Birkenhead, to the very place it was made, en route to the Transport Museum. Birkenhead made around 3,500 trams for many parts of the world up until 1913. In 1853, Peto, Brassey and Betts, the famous railway contractors, gained a large contract to build the Grand Trunk Railway in Canada. So they named their new works on the south side of the West Float Canada Works. They decided to prefabricate as much as possible, such as bridges and rolling stock, at this location. You can just make out Grand Trunk Railway of Canada on the map. In 2018, a commemorative plaque was unveiled near these works on one of the last remaining older buildings in the area. It's a pump house for the dry dock, shown on this map as a canal. Dignitaries such as the Lord Lieutenant of Merseyside and relatives of Stevenson and Brassey attended the occasion. This is the Calag Urini locomotive in Bucharest. Don't ask me to say that word again. What a remarkable survivor. The only known Birkenhead-built loco to have survived. Some other locomotives and rolling stock have been found that were made in the Canada Works, but they are on the seabed off the Isle of Wight. The ventilation shafts, Maurice showed a couple of snaps in his presentation for the Birkenhead Road Tunnel, are very large structures, visible from many parts of Birkenhead and Liverpool. Left, the ventilation building in Taylor Street and its brother in St. John Street, not far away, both listed grade 2. And there is right, the one we saw on Maurice's presentation, right up to the Riverside Pacific Road. The tunnel was opened in 1935, and these buildings were all designed in the same style by Liverpool-born architect Herbert Rouse. These green doors are very large and really need a person alongside to show the size, all beautifully detailed. What slide? Next slide. Where are we going now? There is a need for tidal prediction on the Mersey. There is a 30 feet tidal range in the Mersey between Birkenhead and Liverpool. In 1866, the Bidston Observatory was built by the Dock Board using local sandstone. Accurate time is a prerequisite of navigation, and for many years a gun was electronically fired from Bidston, which was set up on the waterside at Birkenhead. It was called, amusingly, the 1 o'clock gun, last fired in 1969.
10 minutes.
Tides were also...
10 minutes. Sorry.
Okay, 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That's fine. Tides were also predicted for many parts of the world from here. We're staying at Bidston to look at the adjacent lighthouse. There's been a lighthouse on Bidston Hill since 1771, and this present one was built in 1873. You can just make that date out on the rather discreet door lintel left-hand picture. The lighthouse is the most inland lighthouse ever built in the UK. It is 2 miles from the sea. It was used in tandem with a lighthouse closer to the shore at Liso, and the two were leading lights You line up the two lights and you have a safe line to come into port on. That's where the term comes from. Being so distant from the sea, it had to have special optical strength and was the first to use a parabolic reflector, which was 13.5 feet in diameter, probably the largest ever made for a lighthouse. The lamp consumed 1 gallon of oil every 4 hours. It was decommissioned in 1913 as the channel approach changed considerably and it was no use for navigation. And also its colleague at Liso also suffered the same fate due to silting up. Now, where have we heard about silting up? The lighthouse is open for visits occasionally and has a fine second-hand bookshop on the 3rd floor. It's listed grade 2. Next slide, please. This is a very interesting hidden nugget of innovation. In 1886, the 2 railway stations on the newly opened Mersey Railway had 2 deep level stations, Hamilton Square in Birkenhead and James Street in Liverpool. The stations are located too deep to expect passengers to go up steps to ground level. So they came up with a new solution. Over in the United States, they used the first elevator in 1870. So in 1886, the railway built 3 ascending rooms, as they were called, for each station. They were powered by hydraulic rams, hence the high tower at Hamilton Square, seen in the smaller picture, where the weights went up and down. The saloon bodies of the ascending rooms were made by the tramcar firm George Stock, who were quite proud of this strange order. Here's a picture of them. You'll note the protocol. In on the left, out on the right. Very COVID-19, I thought to myself. The layout of the lifts is totally different now. They've reduced the size of the lifts and increased the number of lifts. Now let's move southwards on the River Mersey. Where's my thingy? There we are. We're at Brumbrol village and factory. Can you see where the blue arrow is pointing? In 1854, the firm of Price & Co. moved to Brumbrol and set up a candle factory. It then diversified into related chemicals and was at one time the largest producer of cloth oils, wool oils, stearines, and fatty alcohols. It employed as many as 750. The factory closed in 2009, but the offices survived as seen in the picture. Next slide, please. The larger picture shows Brumbrol village workers' housing. There are 140 houses built about 1880, 17 of which are grade 2 listed. There's a church and a school. It was the second workers' housing after Titus Salt's at Saltaire. But compare the quality of these houses with that of Lever Port Sunlight on the left-hand picture. Much posher, built only 8 years later. Let's move to nearby Port Sunlight now. William Lever built his factory here in Port Sunlight in 1888. His model village followed. The model village has 900 grade 2 listed buildings, so don't even think of painting the gutters green. Even in 1888, they were making as much as 450 tons of soap per week. It had a huge internal railway network and locomotives. The location ensured easy access to soda ash and caustic soda, essential materials for his soap manufacture. The Lever's famous names include Lifebuoy, Lux, and Vim. Lever even had his own dock at Brumbrol, now filled in. By 1919, there were over 8,000 employees. The blue line shows the path of the Staunton Tramway we mentioned earlier, which predated his works. It must have really annoyed him to have these wagons of quarry stone rumbling past the head office doors. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? We've made it to the end. Thank you, learned professors and you lovely people from all over the world and the UK listening to my short. Next slide. I think that's me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rob. We'll now take questions, and I propose that we start off with the two questions we've had around the World Heritage Site of Liverpool being taken away from us. Malcolm took Paul Hyde and Martin Green have both made reference to the fact that we don't have the World Heritage status anymore. The first example was about the Everton Stadium being built, and that was one of the reasons allegedly for us losing the status. Maurice, would you like to comment at all on that?
Can you hear me, Anna?
Yes, I can, yeah.
I've got Paul's question up here.
There's Martin Green a bit further.
Yeah, I've got Paul's question in
Right.
front of me.
Yes.
To what extent are you disappointed about the UNESCO decision about Liverpool and its World Heritage status? I am disappointed. I'm sure everybody else is disappointed. The director of Liverpool Museum made that very comment. She said she was disappointed. I think it's probably an understatement. I think there's scope for a lot more debate on the implications of this sort of thing. We could probably have an hour's debate about the loss of World Heritage status and also the creation of World Heritage status. I noted with some interest recently that, very recently, that the slate landscape of North Wales has been granted World Heritage Site status. I think there are many implications for the future of heritage in this country by what's going on. I don't think this is the right place to debate that, personally. I think it needs a much more serious, long discussion.
I think that addresses Martin's comment as well, unless you'd like to come back on it, Martin Green. Thank you very much, Maurice. Did you want to come in on that at all, Rob?
No, I can't add anything to that.
Okay, thank you. Mary Mills, I find where you are, Mary. Mary Mills says, do you know if the Alabama's Blakely gun was made in the Liverpool area? I understand it was not made at their Southwark works. Do you know anything about that, Rob?
Just speaking off the record without reference to my Encyclopedia Britannica, I suspect it was made by Fawcett Preston, who had a good relationship with Laird's. I'm not certain.
Okay.
I think you're probably right, Rob.
Okay, thank you. There's also a question from Masakai Okada in Japan. Konnichiwa. You're talking about the number of old industrial sites being made into flats and that sort of thing. And you ask, do you think industrial heritageness can be a brand for contemporary converted houses in UK?
I think that's
so
excellent.
Sorry, I don't know if you're asking whether it would be an attraction for people to buy a place like that. Over to you, Maurice and Rob.
I think it's an excellent idea. It doesn't have a brand as such. It's a bit like industrial archaeology. At one time, the phrase didn't exist, and then it existed. And I think it's great to have a label on this conversion of mills, etc., into modern housing. So congratulations to an outsider thinking of a term to describe this change of use.
Okay.
Maurice.
There are some structures, unfortunately not warehouses, which it's very difficult to find an adapted reuse in order to preserve the heritage. The best example I can think of this, I'm going slightly off the topic, but the best example I can think of this is the Cannington Shore Bottle Shop in St Helens, which is a unique structure and is in a terrible condition. It's owned by a property developer, and we hope that we can repair it and conserve it, but it can't be turned into flats. It can't be turned into something convenient. And it's a real challenge to find out how we can conserve such an important building.
If I
Okay.
can come in, Anna, just to
Yes.
say that AIA has an endangered sites officer, Amber Patrick, and we have to comment on a lot of applications for listed building conversion and so on. And you know, our concern is that some element of industrial heritageness, I love that word, is contained within it. And obviously a lot of people are unwilling to buy places that are grade 2 listed or whatever because they can't do things with them. But I think the UK has never used that word, but there's an awful lot of buildings that are converted and retain some element of their past because we think that's important, whatever we call it. So I think we pay a lot of attention to that. Although, I mean, to be honest, textile mills and so on are more easily converted to flats. A lot of other buildings like chemical works or coal mines aren't. So there's a limit to what you can do with that. But it's an important element of industrial heritage in Britain because we can't conserve it all, but we need to conserve the memory in some way or another. So it's an interesting question.
Thank you, Marilyn. There's a question from Steve Roman. Is the railway cutting to Wapping Dock, which was shown with a pair of lines, still used or accessible? Maurice?
No, it's no longer used. It is accessible, but it's across railway lines which are part of the main line into Liverpool. So there is access there on foot, yes. And the tunnel is also accessible, but I'm told that it's partially flooded.
Okay. We've had a couple of comments about former industries. Adrian Bailey, for example, says the sweated labour of cotton spinning mills or industrial illness heritage is double-edged. And Adrian also says Grimsby Ice Factory is another. I don't know quite what you would, if that's just a comment, Adrian, or whether you'd like our speakers to talk about their views on industrial heritage in that way, in terms of the sweated labour and everything. Don't know if you have any comments, Maurice or Rob, about the conditions of work and how that affects our studies of industrial heritage.
Having been down a number of coal mines, I'm amazed anyone would want to work down there, let alone work in the conditions that you find in the 18th and 19th century.
Right. Well, we're running out of questions here.
Difficult for us to put our 21st century heads onto 19th century heads and not comprehend why they acted in the way they do. It's the 2020 hindsight thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all very well. I've just been thinking about the question about the cannon on the Alabama, and I just wish to add a rider. The Alabama was not armed when it left Birkenhead. It was an unarmed ship, and the arms were put on in the Azores, I think. They may have come from another supplier. I think it's I'm sorry to go back to the first question, but a little bell rang and I wish to underscore that fact.
Thank you, Rob. Does anyone have any further questions for our speakers, please? Okay, well, I'm sure everyone can read the comments along the chat line. So may I say thank you very much to Maurice and Rob for their excellent talks. And I'm so sorry that we haven't been able to meet in person with all of you who've taken the time to come into this morning. And I'm looking forward to the next session in September when we have two more speakers for you. One on the Albert Dock and one on one of the other docks in Liverpool. So Marilyn, would you like to take over now?
Yes, Anna. Yes, thank you very much to Maurice and to Rob for very interesting talks. And I'm sorry we couldn't have held them in person, but nevertheless, we have a worldwide audience, which we wouldn't have had. And
Absolutely.
This is the dilemma we now face, of course. Zoom has brought in so many more people, but we miss the social interaction. So we have to find a way of managing both these things. In addition to the talks that Anna mentioned, there are two more events that are part of the AIA conference this year. One is our AGM, followed by our Rolt lecture, the lecture that we give every year, which is in memory of our founder, LTC Rolt. And that is being given by Carrie Newman from Bristol on international communication by telegraphy. She's changed her title a couple of times, but it's along those lines. And then we also have a seminar of speakers that Mike Novell is organising on the effect of the pandemic and of COVID-19 on heritage sites throughout Britain. And you will find messages about that on our website. I've only just been given the details of the speakers, and nor has Bill had them yet, but they will be up on the website. But clearly, this is something that's concerned all of us on a worldwide basis over the last few months, about how such sites have kept going when they haven't been able to open and they haven't had the visitor income like so many other sites, not just industrial heritage sites. So that's 3 more events that are going to be part of the AIA conference. Now, I would urge those of you who are listening who don't belong to the AIA to consider joining. We can't continue to run things like this unless we have some income. And our income, of course, also finances the international journal we publish, Industrial Archaeology Review, as well as Industrial Archaeology News. So please go to our website, which is maintained by Bill Barksfield, our webmaster, and consider joining us. It's not very expensive, honest. And so we hope that we can then organise more of these events, but we do sadly need that income in order to keep going. We're not financed in any other way. I can't see any obvious reaction from John Jones, our treasurer, but I'm sure he agreed. Yes, he just waved at me. So thanks ever so much to the Merseyside Industrial Heritage Society and to Anna. It's sad that we weren't able to visit Liverpool, but your 2 speakers have given us a wonderful background to the area, and we look forward to the further talks, Anna, that are being held next month, as you said, and to our further events. And we're working on next year as an in-person conference, we hope, but certainly to our 50th anniversary in 2023, when we hope to be back in the Armbridge area in Telford. So there's a lot going on. We haven't been able to meet, but we haven't stopped. And there will be a review of Professor Agada's book, which really is exciting to look at. It's wonderful to look at industrial heritage from somebody else's viewpoint. And he is very good on drinking fountains. So thanks very much, Anna. And thanks to everybody for attending today, and hope to see you at the next conference. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.